The night my son died, I promised myself one thing. Whatever happened next, his family would never be alone. I remember standing in the hospital hallway, the smell of antiseptic and burnt coffee, listening to a doctor explain words that no longer mattered. Accident. Instant. Nothing could be done. My ears rang, my hands shook, but one image kept cutting through everything else. His wife, pale and silent, holding their child like the world might fall apart if she let go. In that moment, I decided my life would bend around theirs. I didn't know yet how expensive that promise would become. My son had been 34, careful, responsible, the kind of man who called his mother every Sunday and fixed neighbors' fences without being asked. His wife, Laura, was younger, quieter. She stood beside me at the funeral in a black dress that looked too thin for the cold, nodding whenever someone said they were sorry. Their child was barely two, too young to understand why everyone was crying, too young to know that his father would never pick him up again. After the funeral, people slowly returned to their lives. I didn't. I stayed. I helped Laura pack up the apartment they shared, moved her and the child closer to me. I told myself it was temporary, just until she got back on her feet, just until things felt normal again. I covered rent when insurance delays stretched on. I paid for groceries, daycare, doctor visits. When Laura cried at night, I told her she was doing fine. When she apologized for needing help, I reminded her she was family. The first year passed in a blur of routines. Mornings with the child at my kitchen table, cereal spilled on the floor, cartoons humming in the background. Laura looked exhausted all the time, moving through days like someone underwater. She thanked me constantly, sometimes with words, sometimes just with a look that said she didn't know how she would survive without me. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Supporting them felt like honoring my son, like keeping part of him alive. By the second year, people began to tell me I'd done enough. Friends suggested Laura needed independence. Distant relatives hinted that grief could become a crutch if you let it. I ignored them. They hadn't seen her hands shake when bills arrived. They hadn't heard the child wake up screaming at night, calling for a father he barely remembered. I told myself that love meant staying longer than was comfortable. Time changed things slowly, almost politely. Laura smiled more. She started dressing better, talking about plans. The child grew into a quiet, observant kid who liked puzzles and asked questions most adults brushed off. I noticed Laura no longer apologized when I paid for things. She simply assumed I would. When I hesitated once about another expense, she looked at me with surprise. Not anger, just confusion, as if I'd forgotten my role. 7 years is a long time to be someone else's foundation. I didn't count the money anymore. I told myself it was irrelevant. What mattered was stability. What mattered was that the child had a safe home, a routine, a future. I took pride in that. When people praised me for stepping up, I felt uncomfortable, like they were missing the point. This wasn't charity, this was duty. There were moments, small ones, that didn't quite fit. Laura avoided talking about the weeks before my son's death. She changed details when stories came up, brushed off questions with a laugh or a sigh. I told myself grief scrambled memories. I told myself not to interrogate a woman who had lost her husband. The child, meanwhile, watched everything. He listened more than he spoke, filing things away with a seriousness that felt older than his years. By the 7th year, our lives were intertwined in ways I no longer questioned. Laura managed the household I paid for. I handled paperwork, emergencies, anything that required money or authority. It felt permanent, even if no one said it out loud. I thought I understood the shape of my sacrifice, the quiet cost of keeping my promise. I didn't know then that the first crack wouldn't come from Laura at all. It would come from a child, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd fed him since he was small, asking something so simple and so wrong that it would make me realize how little I truly knew about the life I'd been supporting for 7 long years. Life settled into a rhythm that felt solid enough to lean on. Morning started early, the child padding into the kitchen before the sun was fully up, dragging a blanket behind him. Laura slept later now. She said nights were still hard for her, that grief never really left. It just changed shape. I accepted that. I always had. The child grew taller, sharper. He learned to read quickly, ask questions that made teachers smile and adults uncomfortable. He remembered details I forgot, where I'd put my keys, what day trash went out, the names of neighbors I'd known for years. Laura called him sensitive. I called him observant. I liked having him around. He made the house feel less quiet, less empty. Laura changed too, but more gradually. She stopped wearing black. She laughed more easily, sometimes too easily, at things that weren't funny. She started making decisions without asking me, then informing me afterward as if that was how it had always been. New furniture ordered on my card, a school program paid for without discussion. Each time she explained it was for the child, and each time I told myself that made it reasonable. There were days when I felt like a guest in my own generosity. Laura ran the household with confidence now. She spoke to doctors, teachers, landlords with an authority that hadn't been there in the early years. When people complimented her strength, she accepted it without hesitation. When they praised me, she smiled politely and changed the subject. I noticed she discouraged certain conversations. If someone mentioned my son by name, really mentioned him, not just a vague reference, she'd redirect quickly. Let's not dwell, she'd say. It's better to focus on now. When the child asked questions about his father, Laura answered with short, carefully chosen sentences, then distracted him with something else. I told myself she was protecting him. I didn't ask why it felt like she was also protecting herself. One evening, after a long day, I suggested we look through old photos, boxes from storage, pictures before the accident. Laura stiffened in a way that was almost imperceptible, but it was there. She said it wasn't a good idea, that it would confuse the child. Her voice wasn't angry, just firm, final. I let it go, feeling foolish for pushing. Money continued to flow out of my life quietly, steadily. I stopped tracking it the way I once had. The amounts didn't scare me as much as the expectation behind them. Laura no longer asked if something was okay. She assumed it was. When I hesitated, she reminded me of promises I didn't remember making, conversations I couldn't clearly recall. I wondered if I was just getting old, if memory softened things when it wanted to. The child watched all of this. He watched Laura's moods, the way her voice changed when she spoke to me versus when she spoke to others. He watched how I signed papers without reading them carefully, how I nodded instead of asking questions. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with an intensity that didn't fit his age, like he was waiting for something. One night, while Laura was out with friends, something she'd started doing more often, the child sat across from me at the table, pushing peas around his plate. He didn't eat much. He was thinking. I could see it in the way his brow furrowed slightly, the way he opened his mouth and closed it again. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He shrugged, eyes still on the plate. "Nothing." I didn't push. I learned that questions came to him on his own schedule. A few minutes passed in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the room. Then he looked up at me, head tilted just a little. "You knew my dad really well, right?" "Better than anyone," I said, without hesitation. He nodded slowly, like he was checking something off in his mind. "Then, why does Mom say he didn't like coming home?" The question landed softly, almost gently. Too gently. I stared at him, searching his face for confusion, for misunderstanding. My son had loved being home. He'd built that life carefully. I opened my mouth to correct him, then stopped. "Why would she say that?" I asked. The child shrugged again, but this time his eyes didn't leave mine. "She says it when she's mad, that he stayed out late because he didn't want to be there." I forced a smile, told him adults sometimes say things they don't mean. He accepted that answer easily, too easily, and went back to his food. But something had shifted, not sharply, more like a slow, uncomfortable awareness settling in. That night, lying in bed, I told myself it was nothing. Grief twists stories, children mishear things. I repeated those thoughts until they felt almost convincing. Still, long after the house went quiet, I lay awake, wondering why Laura would rewrite something so small, and why her child remembered it so clearly. After that night, I started noticing things I trained myself not to see. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because silence has a way of amplifying small details once you stop filling it with excuses. Laura became more careful with her words around me. Not kinder, careful. She corrected herself mid-sentence more often, laughed a beat too late, watched my face when she spoke about the past. When she talked about my son, it was always in general terms. He was difficult, restless, under pressure. Never cruel, never overtly negative, just subtly diminished. Each comment felt harmless on its own. Together, they formed a version of him I didn't recognize. I told myself I was being defensive. Of course I'd protect his memory. Of course I'd hear criticism where none was intended. That's what fathers do when they've lost a son. That's what grief sounds like years later. Dull but persistent. The child kept asking questions. Not constantly. Not in a way that seemed obsessive. Just here and there, dropped into ordinary moments like pebbles into still water. Why didn't Dad like that restaurant? Why did Mom say Dad didn't trust people? Why did Dad drive so fast if he was careful? None of the questions were wrong. That was the problem. They were specific. Too specific for someone who'd been barely 2 when his father died. When I gently corrected him, he didn't argue. He listened, absorbed, then went quiet again. It was as if he was comparing 2 versions of the same story and didn't yet know which one to believe. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual and found Laura in the study, going through a box I hadn't opened in years. Papers, old receipts, documents tied to my son's work. She jumped when she saw me, then laughed it off, said she was just organizing. I apologized for startling her. She didn't apologize for being there. Later that evening, she mentioned, casually, that she was thinking of moving. Not far, just somewhere fresh. She said it like a suggestion, but her eyes searched mine for resistance. I asked what prompted the idea. She shrugged and said stability was important for the child, that a new environment could help him grow. I nodded, even as a quiet alarm went off in my chest. We had stability. We had it because I'd built it, piece by piece. I began reviewing things I'd ignored for years. Bank statements, old emails, dates. Nothing obvious jumped out, but the absence of clarity bothered me. Decisions had been made in my name that I didn't remember agreeing to. Conversations Laura referenced that I couldn't place. I told myself I'd been tired, overwhelmed, too trusting. That explanation used to comfort me. Now it felt thin. The child noticed my distraction. He sat beside me on the couch one evening, close enough that his shoulder touched mine. "You're thinking too loud," he said. I smiled. "What does that mean?" "It means your face is saying something you're not," he replied, completely serious. I asked him what my face was saying. He thought for a moment. "That you're trying to remember something important." The room felt smaller after that. I asked him what he was trying to remember. He shook his head. "I already did." I laughed it off, ruffled his hair, told him he was too smart for his own good. He accepted the affection, but didn't smile. Instead, he looked past me, toward the hallway, where Laura was talking on the phone in a low voice. That night, long after everyone was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. For 7 years, I had been protecting this family from loss. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped asking who was protecting the truth. And I had the growing sense that the only person who hadn't been lying, at least not fully, was the child. By the time autumn came, the tension had settled into the house like a draft you couldn't quite seal. Nothing was openly wrong. No raised voices, no confrontations, just the constant sense that every normal moment was balanced on something fragile. Laura pushed harder for independence, but only in ways that still relied on me. She talked about enrolling the child in a better school, one that happened to be more expensive. She spoke about therapy, extracurriculars, trips that were framed as important for his development. Each decision came with urgency, as if delaying even a little would cause harm. When I asked questions, she'd sigh and remind me how much had already been lost, how careful we had to be not to lose more. I agreed more often than I questioned. Old habits don't die easily. The child, meanwhile, became quieter, not withdrawn, focused. He listened the way adults do when they're trying to understand something that doesn't make sense yet. He'd sit at the table drawing while Laura talked, his pencil pausing at certain words, his eyes flicking up for just a second too long. When she left the room, he'd sometimes look at me like he wanted to say something, then think better of it. One evening, while Laura was cooking, the child asked if he could stay with me in the living room. He sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a box of old tools I'd given him to play with. He lined them up carefully, by size, by weight. "Did my dad ever get angry?" he asked without looking up. "Everyone gets angry sometimes," I said, "but he wasn't a scary person, if that's what you mean." He nodded slowly. "Mom says he was unpredictable." That word again, carefully chosen. Adult. "Did she say when?" I asked. "When things didn't go her way." I felt something tighten in my chest. "And what do you think?" He hesitated. "I think she gets angry like that too." Before I could respond, Laura called his name from the kitchen, her tone sharp. He jumped, immediately alert, and went to her without another word. I stayed where I was, staring at the line of tools on the floor, all neatly arranged, all under control. That night, after the child was asleep, Laura told me she'd been offered a job opportunity. Not local, not far either, she said, but far enough that living arrangements might need to change. She spoke as if the decision had already been half made. When I asked how soon, she said opportunities don't wait. I asked where the child fit into this. She smiled and said he'd be fine anywhere as long as she was with him. The implication was clear. My role was logistical, not essential. I found myself asking questions I hadn't asked in years, about timelines, about plans, about why everything felt rushed. Laura's patience thinned quickly. She accused me of undermining her confidence, of treating her like a dependent when she was clearly capable. The argument never fully formed. It dissolved into hurt looks and long silences. The next day, the child came home from school unsettled. He barely touched his food, stared at the wall while I talked. When I asked what was wrong, he said someone in class had asked about his father. A normal question, but it had stayed with him. "Sometimes," he said, "Mom says things like she's reminding herself, not me." The room went quiet around us. I wanted to ask more, to press, to finally pull at the thread I'd been avoiding. But footsteps sounded in the hallway and the moment closed. That night, after the child was asleep, I sat alone and realized I was no longer afraid of being wrong. I was afraid of being right. And I knew, with a clarity that made my stomach drop, that whatever truth was waiting didn't start with Laura's actions. It started with what the child had learned to repeat. The question came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that usually dissolves into memory as soon as it's over. The child was doing homework at the kitchen table, paper spread out, pencil tapping lightly against the wood. Laura was out, running errands. The house felt calm in that empty, held breath way. I was rinsing a cup at the sink when he spoke. "Did my dad know he was going to die?" I turned slowly, drying my hands, already forming the answer I'd given myself for years. "No," I said. "It was an accident." He nodded, but didn't look satisfied. His eyes stayed on the paper in front of him. "Then why did Mom say he should have listened when she warned him?" The words were simple, casual. They landed with a weight that made my chest tighten. I asked him to repeat it, just to be sure I'd heard correctly. He did, word for word, his voice steady. "When did she say that?" I asked. "Lots of times," he replied. "Usually when she's tired or when something breaks." I sat down across from him, keeping my voice even. "What exactly does she say?" He frowned, searching his memory. That if he listened to her, things would be different. That he never listens until it's too late. I felt a cold line trace its way down my spine. My son had died in a car accident. Late night, empty road. Official reports said speed and weather. Nothing about arguments, nothing about warnings. "Does she say what he didn't listen about?" I asked. The child shrugged. "She doesn't say, just that she told him." Silence filled the space between us. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed. The world kept moving, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in that kitchen. I didn't tell the child he was wrong. I didn't correct him. I thanked him for telling me and suggested he finish his homework. He did, obediently, and soon enough the moment was gone. But I stayed at the table long after he'd left, staring at the faint pencil marks in the wood. That evening, I began checking things I'd avoided for years. Old police reports, insurance paperwork, emails my son had sent in the months before he died. I wasn't looking for a confession. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Just context, just something to anchor the story I'd been living in. What I found instead were gaps, conversations cut short, a message my son never replied to, sent late the night he died. Laura's name at the top of the thread. The subject line was empty. I closed the laptop when Laura came home, my face carefully neutral. She chatted about her errands, about traffic, about nothing. When she mentioned my son in passing, her tone was sharp, impatient. He always did things his way, she said, never listened. I watched her closely then, not like a grieving father, like someone finally paying attention. That night, the child knocked on my door before bed. He stood there, small in the doorway, twisting the hem of his shirt. Did my dad know he was going to die? I asked. No, I said, immediately. You didn't do anything wrong. He seemed relieved, but didn't leave. Mom says some things are better not remembered, he added quietly. But I think forgetting makes them bigger. I told him he was right. I meant it. After he went to bed, I sat in the dark and accepted something I'd been circling for weeks. The child hadn't asked a terrifying question because he was confused. He'd asked it because he was starting to understand. And if I wanted to protect him, really protect him, I would have to stop pretending that the past was settled. It started with what the child had learned to repeat. I didn't confront Laura, not then. Not after what the child said. I understood, instinctively, that the truth wouldn't reveal itself under pressure. It would retreat, reshape, find new places to hide. So I did what I should have done years earlier. I watched. I listened. I stopped assuming. I began with small things, dates, times. I compared what Laura said now to what she'd said before. Stories shifted depending on the audience. Details blurred when they didn't serve her. When I asked neutral questions, nothing accusatory, she reacted defensively, as if every inquiry was an attack. She reminded me how much she'd lost, how unfair it was to question her after everything she'd endured. I didn't argue. I apologized. And then I kept paying attention. I requested copies of records I'd never personally reviewed, accident reports, follow-up notes. The process was slow, buried in bureaucracy, but it gave me time to think. I reread old messages from my son, not searching for blame, just listening to his voice again. What I noticed wasn't fear. It was restraint, short replies, delayed responses, a carefulness that hadn't been there before his marriage. Laura's behavior toward the child sharpened too, not cruel, but controlling. She corrected him often, especially when he spoke about the past. If he remembered something incorrectly, she didn't just fix it. She replaced it, firmly, repeating her version until he nodded. I watched him learn when to stop talking. One evening, I heard her in his room, her voice low and tense. I couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm. Explanation layered over instruction. When she came out and saw me, she smiled too quickly. "He has such an imagination," she said. "You have to guide kids or they get lost in it." I nodded. Inside, something settled into place. The records arrived in pieces, nothing dramatic, no single line that screamed guilt. But the timeline didn't sit right. Calls that went unanswered. A delay before emergency services were contacted. Laura had been the last person to speak to my son that night. That fact alone meant nothing, until it meant everything. I asked the child one more question, carefully. I didn't mention his father. I didn't mention the accident. "When Mom gets scared," I said, "what does she do?" He thought for a moment. "She tells me what happened, over and over, so I don't forget." "And what happened?" I asked softly. He looked at me, eyes steady. "That Dad didn't listen, and that listening matters." I thanked him and changed the subject, but my hands were shaking. That night, I understood the shape of the truth, even if I didn't yet know all its edges. Laura hadn't just rewritten the past for herself. She'd been teaching it, carefully, repeatedly, to a child who trusted her completely. Whatever had happened on that road 7 years ago, It wasn't just an accident anymore. It was a story, one that had been rehearsed, defended, and passed down. And I realized then that if I moved too quickly, I would lose more than answers. I would lose the child. So I waited, and I prepared. Waiting changed me. It sharpened my patience into something colder, more deliberate. I stopped reacting and started planning, measuring every word, every movement. Laura noticed the shift, even if she couldn't name it. She asked more questions, checked in more often, watched me the way I'd begun watching her. I made sure nothing looked different on the surface. I paid bills, I nodded at plans, I agreed with her timeline about moving, about schools, about the future she spoke of as if it were already hers. The more comfortable she felt, the less careful she became. She started talking, not confessing, never that, but justifying. She framed the past as a series of pressures, misunderstandings, inevitabilities. She spoke about my son as someone who forced her into corners, who didn't hear warnings, who left her with no real choices. Each story ended the same way, with her as the one who survived. The child stayed close to me during this time. He didn't say much anymore. He didn't need to. I could see the tension in his shoulders when Laura entered a room, the way he relaxed when she left. He followed instructions precisely, as if mistakes carried consequences he couldn't afford. One afternoon, Laura told me she was meeting with a lawyer. Routine, she said. Just paperwork, just to make things official if we moved. She spoke lightly, but her eyes never left my face. I wished her luck and went back to what I was doing. Inside, something clicked into place. That evening, after the child was asleep, I went through everything one last time. Documents, records, notes I'd taken quietly over weeks. Patterns emerged that I could no longer unsee. Not proof that would satisfy a courtroom, proof that would satisfy me. The final piece came unexpectedly. Laura mentioned, offhandedly, a detail about the night my son died that had never appeared in any official account. She corrected herself immediately, but it was too late. The information wasn't something she should have known unless she'd been there longer than she admitted. I didn't react. I didn't ask her to explain. I simply let the moment pass. Watched her realize what she'd done, watched her recover with practice ease. That was when I understood something important. She believed she was safe. She believed the story had held for 7 years and would hold forever. The next morning, I took the child to breakfast before school. He ate quietly, methodically. Halfway through, he looked up at me. "Are things going to change?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "but not all at once." "Will I be okay?" I met his eyes. "You will." He nodded, accepting the answer without asking for more. That was when I knew I was ready. I didn't need to confront Laura with accusations. I didn't need her to admit anything. What I needed was control over timing, over information, over the future she thought she was shaping. And by the end of that day, without raising my voice or breaking a single promise aloud, I made sure she lost all three. I didn't tell Laura anything had changed. I let her believe the future was still unfolding exactly as she'd planned it. She talked about moving dates, about paperwork, about how relieved she was that things were finally coming together. I listened, nodded, asked the right questions at the right moments. Comfort is disarming when someone thinks they've already won. What I did instead was quiet and precise. I separated finances she thought were shared but never legally were. I transferred ownerships, closed permissions, froze access I had granted out of trust, not obligation. I spoke to professionals without her name attached, asked questions that didn't accuse but clarified. Each answer narrowed her options without alerting her to the walls closing in. The lawyer she met with called me the next day. Polite, careful, curious. It turned out certain assumptions Laura had been making about her position weren't supported by anything on paper. Support, it seemed, is only permanent when it's formal. Promises mean very little when they're never written down. I arranged for the child to stay with me for a few days under the pretense of convenience. Laura agreed easily. She trusted me. That was the final mistake. On the second evening, while the child slept in the next room, Laura called. Her voice was sharp now, stripped of warmth. Something wasn't working. Accounts were inaccessible. Decisions had been delayed. People were suddenly asking questions she didn't want to answer. I told her I'd look into it. The next morning, I told her I wouldn't. I didn't explain. I didn't accuse. I simply said that things would be different going forward and that she would need to make arrangements on her own. She demanded reasons. I repeated myself. She reminded me of my son. I stayed silent. By the time she understood the permanence of it, the ground was already gone beneath her. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting. Just a slow realization that the story she'd relied on had reached its end. The child adjusted faster than I expected. Without constant correction, he spoke more freely. He slept better. He stopped asking the same questions. Some truths don't need to be explained once they're no longer being denied. Laura tried, in small ways, to regain control. Messages, appeals, carefully worded reminders of shared history. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I still think about my son, about what he might have seen coming, and what he might have hoped I'd do if I ever understood. I'll never know everything, but I know enough. Enough to protect the one person who didn't choose any of this. Enough to end a lie without turning it into a spectacle. Enough to live with what comes after. The promise I made in that hospital hallway was real. I kept it, just not in the way she expected.